Bonjour à tous. Donc, du coup, je vous propose de commencer. Je vois qu'il est déjà midi 2. On a les 2 minutes meridiennes. Thank you for joining today for this webinar with ClientEarth about the complaint they had recently against BlackRock. Well, we all know that greenwashing has become a major issue for fund managers. The DWAS case was probably the first major one we heard about, with a huge fine in the US and even a police raid in Germany these last years. And more recently, there are some cases with Vanguard in Australia with a fine of 13 million Australian dollars, which is about 8 million euros. Most recently, we also had a case in Europe, in Luxembourg, with Aviva investors. There was a case also. We learned about it, even if the judgment was a little earlier, a few months ago. And the case that we are talking about today is the one that ClientEarth has taken action against BlackRock recently in October for misleading marketing. This is a complaint that is filed to the AMF in France. And so to explain what's happening, what are the reasons for this complaint, we have invited two of lawyers within the accountable finance team at ClientEarth, Alex Bennett and Robert Clark, that are you can see on the screen right now, and they will explain us, why this complaint and all the details. And we'll have like a 30-minute presentation for that, and afterwards you'll have 15 minutes more or less to ask questions. And if you have more, maybe we can take a little more time, but our intention is to be together about 45 minutes. So I leave the floor to Robert first, and there will be slides, and we may probably send you the slides after the meetings for all those of you that wanted to have it with them. Robert, floor is yours.
Thank you, Gregoire, and thanks for joining, everyone. It's great to have the chance to talk you through this work today. So we've got the agenda shown on the slides. We're just going to give an introduction to ourselves and a summary of the complaint. Then I'll talk through some of the framing and context for the complaint. Alex will talk through in a little more detail exactly what we did, the type of laws involved and the alleged breaches, and then we'll end on the implications of the action and with time for questions, as Gregoire said. So first, a little bit about ClientEarth. ClientEarth is a charitably funded environmental NGO with a legal theory of change. We use the power of law to bring about systemic change that protects people and planet. We work on the whole life cycle of the law, from policy advocacy, implementation, and then at the other end, enforcement, to hold public and private actors accountable for the harms to which they contribute. Alex and I are lawyers in the financial sector team, and in our team, we examine the role of financial institutions and markets in environmental degradation, their legal obligations, and the tools we can use to ensure that they contribute to a more sustainable future. And next slide, please, Alex. So first, a quick overview of the complaint, and I should say that this is a summary of the action we took and our interpretation of the legal rules involved. It's not legal advice and shouldn't be relied on as such. So yes, we submitted a regulatory complaint to the AMF in October on the 16th, copying ESMA. The complaint concerns the greenwashing of BlackRock investment funds, specifically a suite of 18 funds that are called sustainable in their name and marketed to retail investors in France and across the EU. And as Alex will explain in more detail, our analysis showed that the group of 18 funds that we looked at had fossil fuel exposure of over $1 billion, and 96% of the fossil companies in the portfolios were increasing fossil fuel production or capacity. So big, overwhelmingly, that represents an investment in fossil fuel expansion. And that's activity known to be deeply unsustainable and incompatible with a safe climate. So this slide we included just to show the extent of press pickup media pickup of the complaint. We were really pleased to obtain coverage in Le Monde and various specialist finance and sustainable finance outlets in Europe, in the UK, and elsewhere. So now I have 3 slides on the context for the complaint, which kind of explains how we saw things and where we're coming from with this particular action. So this first slide speaks to 2 broad patterns in the sustainable funds market. The first is that investment funds are pouring billions of dollars, billions of euros into fossil fuels and fossil fuel expansion, in general. So the most recent Investing in Climate Chaos report showed that as of 2024, investment funds held $5.1 trillion in fossil fuels. BlackRock is the second largest investor in fossil fuels. It's behind only Vanguard, and its total fossil investment is around $431 billion US. The second broad trend here is that greenwashing is rife in the EU investment fund markets, with funds marketed as sustainable being very heavily invested in fossil fuels. And our legal work built on 2 very timely research reports. The first by Reclaim Finance, and I saw that Clara had joined the call. Their research showed that 70% of 430 sustainable funds analysed were exposed to fossil fuel expanders. Similarly, Follow the Money found that 40% of over 1,000 sustainable funds analysed were invested in fossil fuel companies. And you might have seen that Reclaim Finance followed up their work with a letter to the AMF calling for action to address systemic greenwashing in the French market. But we saw a need to complement that work with a focused critique on specific funds where we think the marketing breaches legal rules, and to call for specific direct intervention by the regulator. This is clearly a global issue and an EU-wide issue, but BlackRock is a significant example of market practice. It's the world's largest investment manager, and it is a high share of sustainable funds that are exposed to fossil fuels. And then next slide, please, Alex. Yeah, so the second part of the context is regulatory enforcement. As Gregoire mentioned, this isn't happening in a vacuum. We do see some enforcement by financial regulators already in relation to greenwashing. In some cases with significant, kind of modest, kind of significant, depending on how you look at it, fines and publicity bringing the risk of reputational damage. So we've seen the US Securities and Exchange Commission particularly active, likewise the Australian regulator. And I just made a note to say that the Australian regulator's enforcement against Vanguard culminated in Australian Federal Court ordering Vanguard Investments Australia to pay the 12.9 million Australian dollar fine shown on the screen. So it's a regulator, but it's also court action. And it's worth noting as well that there's been a recent AMF action ending in a negotiated settlement with Primonial Rain, French investment manager, negotiated to prevent further investigation. But then we look at these enforcements that do exist, and they can kind of be classified as concerning a failure of promise. So you say you will apply a certain process, you say you'll apply exclusions, and you fail to do so. You say there won't, we'll screen out tobacco and fossil fuels, and then there's fossil fuel and tobacco in the portfolio. That totally has a very important role to play in the integrity of the market, but we saw a need to push enforcement out of that comfort zone slightly to protect the meaning of key sustainability terms and defend the principle that it's not sustainable to invest in fossil expansion. So although failures of promise did occur in the funds we looked at, the key point we were looking at was how is the fund marketed? It's called sustainable, and how does that compare to the holdings in the fund? So next slide, please, Alex. So finally, sustainability and what it means in the context of fossil fuel investment. And I'm sure this will largely be familiar to you, so I'll just go through it quickly. But the simple point we sought to assert in the complaint is that it cannot be considered sustainable to invest in further fossil fuel expansion. So we know that climate harm is real, it's happening now, is happening in Europe. The picture on the right shows the flooding in Valencia from October, which killed over 200 people. So we know that continuing headlong into an unsafe climate with current levels of fossil fuel production is compromising the ability of future generations to meet their needs. It's unsustainable by definition. We know from the IPCC scientific consensus that to hold warming to well below 2 degrees or to 1.5 degrees, we need rapid and deep and immediate emissions reductions in all sectors. But we also know that we're off track. Emissions from existing and planned fossil infrastructure will deliver heating well above 2 degrees. The graph on the left shows is from the UN emissions gap report from this year, and it shows that report showed that we're on track for 3.1 degrees of warming. The gap between the top line and the bottom line on the chart shows the emissions gap of where we need to be versus where we're headed for 2030, and it's really significant. And in that context, the International Energy Agency has confirmed multiple times that no new long lead time oil and gas projects are needed in scenarios compatible with 1.5 degrees, and no coal mines or coal mine lifetime extensions are needed either. The UN expert group on corporate transition planning has translated that into red lines for investment, calling for an immediate end to lending and investing in coal infrastructure, and an end to investment in fossil fuel expansion. And the AMF, in its own transition plan guidelines, guidance issued recently, has recognized those red lines from the UN group. So that, just pausing there, that sort of ends the framing for the complaint and the territory we were looking to work in. And as I said, the point we're seeking to assert is that it's not sustainable for investment funds to invest in fossil fuel expansion. And that's the issue we've asked the AMF to address. And Alex is now going to talk through in a bit more detail what we looked at, how we did it, what we found, and the legal rules invoked in our complaint.
Thank you very much, Rob, and it's great to have you all on this call. So in the context of the widespread greenwashing of funds identified by both Reclaim Finance and Follow the Money, we needed to focus our analysis in this work. And we did so by looking at funds which are actively managed and which are marketed to retail customers. And in terms of the retail customers, this was in light of EU jurisdictions, a more rigorous guidance is provided generally around the regulatory application of financial communication rules for ordinary investors. And as Rob has already mentioned, critically, we focused on funds with the term sustainable in the name. Now, the reason why we looked at the name is because the name is its most significant marketing tool. It's a key piece of information used by investors when making an investment decision, and at what ESMA has called a high-risk area for greenwashing. We also took the term sustainable as used across multiple funds in the EU, more so than, say, green or net zero. But really, we were thinking about what sustainable means in both the natural meaning and given the scientific analysis that Rob has already referred to. And we want explicit clarity on what that term means to investors and what it should mean in terms of its use by fund managers. We felt that this was a good starting point when compared, for example, to the broader terminology such as ESG, which is harder to sharply define, some would say, and certainly more diverse, covering as it does several different limbs. So this initial research indicated that BlackRock had the largest number of EU marketed funds which met this criteria, although we will say that this is not a problem that's simply isolated to BlackRock. It occurs across several different funds and fund managers. And we identified 18 BlackRock funds from this initial research, 2 of which are Article 9 funds and 16 of which are classified as Article 8 funds under SFDR. As Rob's already mentioned, across these 18 funds is approximately 1.04 billion of US dollars invested in fossil fuel companies, which are listed on GSEL or Google, the Global Coal Exclusion List, and the equivalent list for oil and gas. Now, we use those as reference points in order to identify those companies active in fossil fuel, and in particular those which are expanding their fossil fuel capacity or production. And in carrying out this research, we partnered with Reclaim Finance, who carried out detailed and precise data analysis using fund holding data provided by Morningstar, and it's their invaluable analysis which has underpinned all of our work in this respect. And we're very grateful to them. So, and thank you, Clara, who's appeared on the screen there. Thank you. Okay, so to the findings, you can see the headline figures on this slide, which I won't read out, but in brief, we have that substantial figure of 1.04 billion, 96% of which is in companies which are developing production or capacity. There's a systemic investment across these funds into companies with the biggest short-term expansion plans globally, and these companies include Total, Equinor, Shell, Eni, Chevron, ConocoPhillips, BP, and ExxonMobil. And in addition, some of these companies are also the highest CO2 emitters in the world: Exxon, Shell, BP, Chevron, and Total. As we argue that by calling themselves sustainable, but nonetheless investing in some of these most damaging companies in the world, these funds are misleading customers and the funds themselves are being missold. In order to provide a little more context, I should say that we did also carry out similar analysis in relation to a substantial, if smaller, subset of control funds also provided by BlackRock. These were retail investment funds marketed by BlackRock with similar or the same asset classes as our target funds, but which did not mention themselves or market themselves as being sustainable. And we found little to no difference between the two sets of funds, which reinforced our conclusion that the use of the word sustainable in the fund name does not distinguish a particular approach of the funds or their asset allocation. And this element of our research highlights the lack of substance that BlackRock was applying to this use of the term, showing that this term is being used is meaningless at best and misleading at worst. I'll also touch on engagement. These holdings cannot be explained by BlackRock's engagement strategy. Although BlackRock explains in the SFDR disclosures for the funds how it engages with investee companies, including on ESG matters, the funds each explicitly state that engagement is not used as a means of achieving the fund's sustainable investment objectives, i.e., inclusion of damaging companies in the portfolio is not done with an explicit aim of persuading them to transition or by threatening disinvestment in the event that companies fail to meet transition goals. Engagement plays no part in the justification of having these companies in these funds. So onto the legal basis of our complaint. We've argued that for the reason Rob has outlined, that by no measure can these holdings be considered sustainable, and that therefore these funds are all in breach of fundamental rules which underpin regulation of financial products. Our primary argument is that by using the term sustainable in these fund names, that BlackRock is in breach of existing fair, clear, and not misleading rules designed to protect consumers from mis-selling. And you can see that we've listed there the various pieces of EU legislation which underpin these basic principles, and I won't repeat that list here. You will all be familiar with these rules, which are designed to protect investors, requiring communications about financial products to be clear, fair, accurate, and not misleading. So that was the primary basis of our complaint. But we also argue in relation to the two Article 9 funds, as I'll come on to explain, that they're in breach of various SFDR disclosure requirements, but also in the application of the do no significant harm test. We suggest that the exposure to these holdings cannot meet do no significant harm requirements, i.e. companies which are engaged in fossil fuel expansion or operating inconsistently with the Paris temperature goals cannot pass that test sufficiently to be considered sustainable investments for the purposes of the regulation. You will all also be aware of the ESMA naming guidelines which are coming out, which were published this year and will be coming into force in various EU jurisdictions next year. Our argument supported by and anticipates these naming guidelines, which build on existing fair, clear and not misleading regulations to address the risk that misleading sustainability disclosures may give rise to greenwashing, focusing particularly on naming principles. The guidelines explicitly provide that products using the term sustainable in their name must not invest in companies to which the Paris-aligned benchmarks apply. So they cut through any confusion or cut through any complexity in relation to the use of terminology in funds to say explicitly that funds using the word sustainable should not include investment in coal, oil and gas industries. The test applied is slightly different than ours in that it's based on revenue thresholds, but the underlying principle is the same, i.e. that investing in fossil fuel companies that are developing new capacity are not sustainable. So on to the specific breaches that we have alleged in our complaint. Under the breach of existing fair, clear and not misleading rules, we argue that the fund name is misleading. Holdings are inconsistent with the sustainable fund name, which obscures the real nature of the fund, which is to invest in some of the most damaging companies in the world. The investment objectives are also misleading by omission in that they make no explanation for the inconsistent holdings or that the fund will invest in fossil fuel companies, in particular those that are expanding. They provide partial, unclear and misleading information, and sometimes which is entirely inaccurate. Certain funds make claims, for example, to limit investment into higher emitting companies, which we've already seen is simply untrue. And you'll see from the couple of examples that we've pulled out there that the only explanation provided in investment objectives or other disclosures is that there is a tilt towards companies which take into account ESG criteria. Our argument states that it is not enough to tilt towards companies, one, which may be well placed to manage ESG risks and opportunities, but alternatively that they're not, this is insufficient to justify the use of sustainable, where it does not result in the exclusion of companies which are demonstrably operating incompatibly in relation, operating damagingly in relation to climate change. Alternatively, these criteria are simply not applied properly given the nature of these funds' investments. We also allege breach of fund exclusions, and we've seen from what Rob has said that these types of claims have been enforced in other jurisdictions. About 6 of our funds, 1 Article 9 and 5 Article 9 funds, all appear to be in breach of their own exclusions, which prohibit investment into companies active in thermal coal. And then we've also cited breaches of SFDR disclosures, stating that exposures to the inconsistent holdings breach the do not significant harm requirements, meaning that funds cannot meet their sustainable investment objective. So, implications and considerations. So, you know that we've brought this complaint to the attention of the AMF. They were our first port of call for redress or enforcement. Greenwashing is pervasive across EU markets, and we are in dialogue with other regulators. But the AMF was our first port of call as a regulator who has shown sensitive positioning on EU sustainable finance, and also in order to build on the valuable work that Reclaim Finance have done in their dialogue with the AMF. We are waiting to hear what steps the AMF will be taking. We've asked the AMF to require BlackRock to either change the language it uses when speaking of these funds and when marketing and naming them, or alternatively to reallocate its portfolio so that its investments are consistent with the way in which it's being marketed, and ultimately to stop the mis-selling of these funds which are falsely marketed as sustainable, and provide appropriate sanction or redress against BlackRock for these misleading activities. More holistically, we want to increase public trust in sustainable investment products. We want to protect the market's integrity by having only products which are actually sustainable being called as such, and reduce the misdirection of private finance into misnamed products, and refocus, redirect all of those investments into genuinely sustainable investments. So if there were any practical considerations for you to take away today, I would say that we would encourage you to look at fund naming practices and think about how the fund name might be undermined by certain assets in the portfolio, how any claims made in the name or in the investment objectives are supported in the documentation and disclosures, is it enough to have a tilt towards slightly less poor companies within a portfolio, and or are those tilting strategies being correctly applied? And finally, think about do no significant harm assessments to ensure that they are applied across the whole portfolio, applied sensitively and applied properly. And all of this with an eye to regulatory risk. As I think is clear from our presentation, there is growing regulatory scrutiny of this matter, and this is going to persist, particularly when the ESMA guidelines come into force next year. And thank you. Unless you've got anything more to add there, Rob, I think I will open the floor up to questions.
No, that's great. Thank you, Alex. Yeah, let's do that.